Hi, I'm Sylvia Burgos Toffness, and this is Deep Roots Radio, the face to face edition. This show trains a spotlight on the connections between what we eat and how it's grown because every dollar you spend on food or clothing, lumber or healthcare products can either help or hurt the environment. What you buy promotes humane livestock management or perpetuates harmful conditions. Your purchases can also help farmers make a living wage or continually struggle to make ends meet. Every guest brings knowledge and experience and perspectives that illustrate the linkages between farming practice and health, the health of the land, livestock, we humans, and our economy. My guests come from all across the country and around the world. They describe efforts that point us to more vital and just systems. I hope you enjoy this interview. And I am so glad to have with me today Dr. Ann Stobart. She is a trained and highly experienced clinical herbalist, a designer and implementer of permaculture in the way of medicinal forests. She is host to hundreds of visitors and a teacher and a blogger. She also is the author of 3 books so far. Household Medicine in 17th Century England, that's one. The Medicinal Forest Garden Handbook, and her latest book, Trees and Shrubs That Heal. And thank you so much for joining us again from Devon, England. And I must ask about the weather. How is it there right now?
It's slowly improving. We have a chill north wind, but it's getting there slowly.
So are things emerging from the ground right now? Are leaves coming out, or is that?
Yeah. I've got plants that need to go out. We have to wait until about the end of May before all the risk of frost is past. That's the problem.
That's interesting to know because that's kind of the zone that we're in right here in the upper Midwest as well. Usually we don't dare put things out until the middle of May.
Mm.
And in fact, we had frost 2 nights ago. Well, and we're at our 5th interview, and we're looking at actually designing your medicinal forest garden. And most people think about herbalism and they think of these herbaceous plants, the ones that spring up as the weather warms and then die off in late fall. But we're talking about a whole different set of plants,
Oh.
something that will grow year round or be in the ground year round. Permaculture. Can you give us a definition as we start off? What is permaculture?
So it's nothing to do with permafrost. Permaculture is about sustainable solutions and using natural principles. And permaculture is a wonderful system, really, because it isn't just about growing; it's also about how we might live sustainably in biodiversity. And I'm just thinking that the ethical principles of permaculture are very attractive to me. There are three main ethics. One is things need to be good for people. Another is that things need to be good for the planet, i.e., the environment and so on. And the third is fair shares, the idea that whatever we do, plan or design, should, if it produces resources, then they should be used to benefit everyone. So for me, permaculture is about a way of life as well as the more kind of narrow definition, which most people are familiar with, the idea of permanent planting or forest gardens, that is, setups which can be sustainably harvested without having to be dug up every year.
Now, permaculture, now that you've talked about what that might be, some might think that, well, this is an approach that can only be used when you've got lots of acres available to you. Is that the case?
No, not really. I think it's a design framework that can be applied even in the smallest gardens. And for example, I have a tiny cottage garden here in Devon in southwest England. I think it's probably something like about 20 foot wide by about 40 foot deep.
Mm.
And it's full of plants. But the thing about them is that they're plants from the ground up. So I've got a sort of herbaceous layer low down. I've got shrubs. I've got trees, which are kept cut to size because of the space being a bit small. I've got climbers. I've got walls and lattices with things growing up them. So I'm using every single space. You can't see the soil really. So it doesn't really matter. Even if you only had a window box, you could still use the ideas of layers and other practical ways of making the whole thing more sustainable.
Mm. Now, in your most recent book, the one that came out in January of 2024, you really took a focus on trees and shrubs that heal, taking a look at their constituents and how they would be applied. The book that you published 4 years earlier, and I've got a copy right next to me, the Medicinal Forest Garden Handbook, really goes into that whole idea of how to design. What kinds of trees and shrubs would you plant? How would you plant them? You talked about layers so that people could understand, oh yeah, if you've got a really tall plant, on the south side of your property, this is what you might want to plant in its shade. You go through certain kind of really wonderful details on how to get started in this, what to sketch out. You yourself applied these principles to your own, actually very large project called Holt Wood. Can you describe what Holt Wood, how you got started with that, what it looked like, what your purpose was?
For sure, yes. We were very lucky to establish the project, but the ideas go back further. When I qualified as a medical herbalist, I completed the equivalent of a 4-year training here in the UK, including clinical sciences and herbal materia medica and lots more. And I had a dispensary, so I had shelves of herbal tinctures and teas and capsules, and quite a lot of them come from trees. And I knew that I was buying them in, for example, things like hawthorn tincture. And on the label, I could see that this tincture was from trees imported. The berries or the leaves and whatnot were imported from Europe and further afield. And I just couldn't understand why in some cases, because, for example, hawthorn grows everywhere in this country. And so I really started thinking about growing my own. I was already a keen vegetable grower, gardener, lots of houseplants and so on. So I really desperately wanted to grow some of my own, and particularly trees. I was keen on experimenting a bit, if you like, with being more sustainable. And I was just lucky that we happened across a spot of land for sale. We have an organisation in this country that sells small woodlands, and we were able to purchase just 2.5 acres of Sitka spruce plantation, which sounds a bit unlikely, but it was that then enabled me to try out some of my ideas about growing trees and shrubs for my herbal practice here in the UK.
Ah. So you say about 2.5 acres of spruce. So what steps did you take to transform what was there into what you wanted?
So it was a transformation. It was an amazing transformation of a redundant conifer plantation. The Sitka spruce, I think, had been planted as an investment about 40 years before.
Mm.
And they'd been looked after. They were well grown, beautiful Sitka spruce trees, but it was a very dark and kind of poor soil underneath. And so we had to do something pretty devastating. We couldn't really just take a few of the trees down. We had to take them all down. We were very fortunate to find a friendly local contractor who did this in a very sympathetic way. It was about 1,000 Sitka spruce altogether,
Wow.
and they would have gone for planking, pine planks, and chip as well. But in the UK, we have this rather strange situation that European imports tend to undermine the price for conifer
Mm.
wood and timber, so that uh, they they don't attract much value now,
Ah.
which in some ways is good because now they're being replaced with more native plantations bit by bit. But anyway, so we were very fortunate to get in a small scale contractor who took out the trees one by one. Um, we had the trees were planted in rows, and so we ended up with lots of ridges and furrows, but it did look a bit like a bomb site when they were
Mm.
done. We left the stumps in the ground to rot down rather than to try and take them out, and then we planted around them. So we came up with a scheme for planting which um, involved, I think I had color coded bamboo canes, which in the end didn't come to much. But we had advice from the local forestry commission on replanting, and we had to get a license from them to take, I think, more than 5 cubic meters of timber. You have to get a license, and we were able to get some advice and a bit of financial support
Mm.
for replanting on a mixed basis, that is, some native and some introduced trees.
Now, was your land fairly flat, or was it rolling? Was there any water feature in there?
So this was a very beautiful bit of Devon in towards North Devon, which sloped down towards the River Torridge, and the River Torridge is noted for wildlife, and the area, the grasslands around the River Torridge, sometimes known as culm grasslands, which is quite a rare environmental feature based on the wildlife and the native plants. So we had a very varied kind of plot. We had poor soil bereft of nitrogen, with a
Mm.
kind of a pan. We had a stony,
Uh,
rocky slope, and we had a soggy meadow level, quite rich piece of land. So that actually worked to our advantage because it meant that we could plant a whole range of different
mm.
species that liked different conditions, from wet to dry and well draining and so on.
That's so interesting to hear, because I think many of us who might be considering, oh, I think I'll take I'll take a page from Anne's book, and I'll do something like this on my scale, might take a look at their land, and that initial assessment is really important. And say, oh my goodness, I've got so many problems here. I need some nice big flat space, and that's not really the case.
Not at all. I think you can really work around. I mean, some things may not change. For example, if the soil is typically acid, which grows a lot of useful plants in medicinal herb terms, is unlikely to be changed quickly. We
Mm.
were advised that we might have to add calcium to our soil, but in fact, the thing about observation that you mentioned is really quite crucial, because I tested the soil in various places on the site and discovered that even though we'd had these conifers, the soil wasn't particularly acid. It
Mm.
was just below about pH of 6, which
Okay.
is actually ideal for growing quite a lot of plants. It won't grow the wildflower meadows that are calcium lovers, but it'll grow most everything else, which was great. But this observation thing meant that we were able to go around and have a look at the water courses where water would be flowing, or where we might
Hmm.
flow it by channels and the like. We could look at ways of building up banks of soil, or digging out areas to become boggy areas. We could make all those changes within this sort of limited area. But the one thing that we had to do right at the beginning was to put in a deer fence, because in UK we certainly have a lot of nibbling deer, from small ones to larger ones. And so it had to be a 2-meter high piece of fencing, which actually was not such a problem because it was a fairly small site. But in a larger site, I think people would have to look at other ways of protecting newly planted trees.
All right. So I'm actually going to question you about that a little bit, because here I am, uh, sitting on what would be considered a very small Midwest farm. It's only 72 acres.
Mhm.
And um, the idea of trying to fence in even half of that feels very, very burdensome in the way of finances.
No,
And so,
agree.
yeah, so I've actually last year I planted a number of shrubs. I have witch hazel, also dogwood. Um, I've got some forsythia, and it turns out that these are favorites of our local deer.
Oh,
Yeah. So, what might there be another strategy to protect those shrubs?
well, it may be that some shrubs just need to get established, and once they're established and out of range, high enough, if you like, um, then they'll be okay. And
Ah,
so protection might have to be physical, as in some kind of netting around each
okay.
tree, and so on. We used small plastic guards, and we found that they were quite effective to stop voles from nibbling at the young trees. Another thing that I looked at, which was quite useful, if you cut back hawthorn or anything that's quite spiky, then that can be laid around young trees and is quite an effective protection. And that's
Oh
something
my,
that then you can move on. So you can use other prickly things, like if you're harvesting prickly ash, for example, it may be that the branches and twigs would be an effective protector. But at the end of the day, it may be that some of the lower plants may have to be kept back into a fenced area. So it
okay.
might be wise to think of both the wild, if you like, and then the more garden type focus with a some kind of protective fencing.
Well, I am really excited about what you said. And because I have prickly ash enough to fill a city. And so harvesting some of that to use around some of my shrubs is one immediate, I think, response that at least I'll try. The other thing I have is at least 2 dozen hawthorn. And as you know about hawthorn, they can get quite scraggly and multi-trunked. And so I think what I'll do is actually use that to my advantage, trim back some of those uh, branches, but also to even simply pick up a lot of what has already fallen to the ground and use those. So you have you have provided me with a couple of approaches here that I think I'm going to be implementing this weekend, because it's readily available, and good advice. Good advice. So thank you for that. And you talked about um, the layering aspect. Some plants grow very tall, others are shrubs, others are smaller plants, that you have to take into account how these different canopy layers affect one another, how they're planted in reference to water flow and sunlight. So those things that need sun get sun, those things that can thrive in shade are able to do that as well. When I was taking a look at some of my notes from a permaculture class that I attended, one of the things that they mentioned that was very important was how you plant things in proximity to where you live, so that um, as a really obvious perhaps example, you don't want to plant your vegetable garden 500 feet away from the house necessarily, because the likelihood of your getting there in time to do some really effective weeding gets reduced the further away it is from where you kind of live all the time. Does that come into play at all when you're designing your forest garden, or is that an aspect that really uh, is not as important?
No, you're spot on actually, because one of the there are a dozen principles in permaculture design that are covered in permaculture training courses, and one of the principles is effective use of energy, and of course getting around is quite important. So there are suggestions for zoning areas, zone 0 being where you live or where you spend most of your time, and then zone 1 is the kind of the vegetables that need immediate attention, maybe daily watering and such like, and then zones 2, 3, 4 and 5 move further out till you get to the 5th zone, which is the wilderness, where you rarely visit. And it's quite an important aspect of the planning. And of course this brings us back to the observation, because for example, when we first took on this space, we realized there was a lot of rock on our slope because over the years water had drained away soil. What we didn't think about, but we later realized, is that we could use that rock to make a track from one side of the plot to the other. We were at that time thinking about setting up some beehives, so we needed to have good access from one side of the space to the other. So you can tie together this zoning with the resources that are available and relate it to things like water distribution and so on. And we did in fact have close to our entrance area, we had some herb beds that required quite frequent harvesting, flower beds and the like. So yeah, so the zone idea is just one of the many ideas that permaculture offers, and it's one of the things that I talk about because I put together, on the basis of our experience, a course online on permaculture design. And so one of the sessions in there focuses on the design angle. But of course, these principles will apply whether you're talking about a large or smaller space. So you can think about acres and acres of wilderness, or you might just think about a space. For example, in our cottage garden, I've got a space to one side which I just allow to run wild, and it's a great space. Partly it's the space where I throw the slugs when I find them, but it's a great space for the birds and the butterflies to inhabit undisturbed, compared to the other areas which are much more heavily used. Of course, the other thing about it is that people need to be able to walk around when they're visiting for courses and so on. So you've got to think about the accessibility of your different spaces. And this provides another opportunity. Permaculture is full of wonderful kind of extra bonuses. Making access routes means that you're making paths and tracks. So you're creating edges, and edges are full of light. They allow the light in usually. So then you can create more layers of plants. So all these things help to create more opportunities.
Now, when you overlay the principles of permaculture with medicinal herbalism, what do you end up trying to design, Anne?
One of the things that I'm after is something that can be sustainably harvested. So we talked earlier about harvesting branches to protect trees, but of course I'm keen to be harvesting leaves and flowers and fruits and bark as well, to be often to be dried, but sometimes to be made into tinctures and so on. So these are harvests. Some of them can be taken throughout the year, particularly aromatics and conifers, but others have to be taken more seasonally. So it's a case of grabbing what's available while you can. And it it's an interesting thing that I find when I'm talking to people about herbal medicine and planting medicinal herbs in their garden and so on. If you don't harvest the plants, then in some way they become straggly and become more and more unusable. And so, to me, harvesting is part of the key, that there's a sort of ongoing sustainable program, whether it's from coppicing or pruning or in other ways.
It's so interesting, and because the whole idea of permaculture and how things are laid out, and actually being out there and trimming, harvesting throughout the year is so um, is so counter the American paradigm of agriculture. In America, because of the space that we have. I mean, this is an outgrowth. It's a philosophical paradigm that's been an outgrowth of the space that we have. Um, you're used to doing things big. You don't have 10 acres of corn, you've got 10,000 acres of corn. You don't have timber on 5 acres, you've got it on 500 acres. So it's designing things large and in a monoculture. And so it's large, it's a monoculture, and it's usually highly mechanized. The other thing is that because of our history in agriculture here, you tend to think seasonally. And so you plant in the spring, you cultivate all summer, and you harvest in the fall. And nothing happens outside of that. And so some of that kind of approach has also seeped into how people think about medicinal herbalism. It's only available, when it's 60 degrees or warmer and the sun is shining. Before and after that, it just doesn't. It's an image that just doesn't exist in many people's minds. So I truly, truly appreciate the things that you've said, because it for me as an American, it means things are available all the time, and you help us, in kind of assume a different lens so that we can see what's there. And so certainly that's one of the things that I've appreciated very much from your books and from your online course, because I was really happy to take that online course when I found it, and through it to then have discussions and to meet you. Do you find that approach, that kind of little bit of a stiff mindset, is also prevalent in other places where you've lectured or taught?
I think there is a bit of a change going on, because we also have not quite hundreds of acres, but close, of monocrops here in the UK. Huge fields of wheat and potatoes and so on. So, and there are some big changes, I think, going on. There's a lot of interest in agroforestry, and so here that boils down to animal welfare with trees, which is great, pasture being planted up, but also agroforestry. There's more kind of experimentation going on now about introducing lines of trees, which are wide enough to allow for mechanized cropping in between. And that's a really interesting development. For example, a few years back, I went to visit a field that was planted up with prickly ash. They were looking for Szechuan peppers, actually,
Right.
elder, if I remember, trees, and some kind of specialist apple. And in between, they would be cropping. So the harvest would be used for botanical spirits or other specialist spices and the like. And meanwhile, they could be annual crops in between. And so, some of these ideas I did put into my books and also into my courses. And so I think there is a change, but the problem, of course, is the necessity for change and the funding for change are sort of moving forward. But what we need is more examples of what's possible.
Right.
But the forest garden approach is a much smaller scale activity where you're probably looking at hand harvesting, self-help, and sustainability. But agroforestry can offer something a lot bigger, and there are lots of benefits being found for the soil as well as biodiversity. So I think we're sort of moving in the right direction. The problem that I'm kind of interested in at the moment is the market side, the commercial
Hmm.
prospects. It seems to me at present that making sure that things are organically accredited is harder in a perennial woodland structure. It's not impossible, but we need to make progress with that. And woodlands are so incredibly productive that I mean, we found this at Holt Wood, that we started making body care products because we we had so much material we didn't know what to do with it, more than I could use myself as a herbal practitioner. And what we
Right.
needed was change in the market. We needed people to be more committed to buying herbal products and contracting to buy these things. Until that happens, because of the costs, it seems like small producers that add value by making products are likely to be the winners at the moment,
Ah,
before we go large, as it were.
got it. Well, Anne, we've actually come to the end of our fifth interview. And one of the things I'd like to wrap up with is for you to let us know, how can people find out more about the medicinal forest gardens and how to understand it and how to begin it in their own land?
So it would be wonderful if people would have a look at my website, the Medicinal Forest Garden Trust website. There's quite a lot of information there. There's a page, we can put the link in the sort of show notes. There's a page which lists the plants, the trees that we actually planted at Holt Wood, so people can see a little more detail about how that worked. There's information also about the books and links to the courses, and links also to a newsletter I write a couple of times a month about all aspects of medicinal forest gardening, on a Substack as Medicinal Tree Woman. So there's quite a few ways of finding out more, and it would be great to hear from people who are interested.
Please go to my YouTube channel for additional show notes and for a link to Anne's newsletter. Also, be on the lookout for her books: The Medicinal Forest Garden Handbook, Trees and Shrubs That Heal, and Household Medicine in 17th Century England. Until next time, discover the amazing world of healthful plants wherever you live.